Welcome to the Sleeping Barber Podcast.
Hey, thanks for tuning into this episode with Dale Harrison. This is a great episode. So many things in here to chew on. Zombie metrics, how they're misleading us, why data literacy is so important for marketers to become really, truly credible in the boardroom, and a little bit about how to think about the future marketing outside of the funnel. And just before we get started with this episode, V and I would love for this show to be super valuable to you. So if you could rate the podcast, leave a review, leave some feedback about who you'd like to hear about or the topics that are really important to you, that'd be great.
Welcome to the Sleeping Barber Podcast, the place for business leaders to get the best and most credible information on marketing, strategy, and innovation. Your hosts, Mark Binkley and Vasilis Douros, share their experiences as they gather insights from the world's leading experts. Now, on with the show.
Welcome back to the Sleeping Barber. This is the third episode in our measurement series, and today we're bringing back Dale Harrison, consultant from Inforda Life Sciences Services. Dale, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be back. It's always fun. Yeah,
it's great. And you've been really busy publishing a ton of stuff since we last spoke. One of the things that kind of caught my eye from way back when was a post you had about zombie metrics, or a couple posts about zombie metrics. So we figured, if anybody has can provide some insight and guidance on measurement and data literacy for marketers, you'd be the guy to bring that home for us. So we're going to geek out on a few kinds of measurement, take a trip down the funnel, talk about data literacy, talking about the influences of what influences our frameworks for measurement, talk about some metrics, and just generally have an open sort of casual conversation about some really fun, geeky number stuff. So thanks for joining us.
Dale Harrison Unplugged.
First, it was Eric Clapton.
I'm always unplugged.
Why don't we start with the zombie number thing? Because, that's the theme around data literacy. Can maybe just describe what zombie numbers are? We all have a ton of data around us. There's, we're all getting... There's a landslide of data. There's no shortage of data. Maybe you could talk about a little bit about zombie numbers.
Yeah, it's a good starting point because I think it's a good example of the danger of not thinking about what you're doing when you play with a number. Just blindly accepting something you saw someone say because it sounds good. And there's quite a number of these zombie numbers that have floated around for, in some cases, more than a century in marketing. One of the big ones is rule of 7. That you need, every person needs to see your stuff 7 times before they can act, which, originally started out as the rule of 6, invented by a salesperson to sell more magazine ads back in the mid-1850s. And then it was updated to the rule of 20 by another magazine salesman in the 1880s. And then the current incarnation is from yet another magazine ad salesman for Variety in 1937, who changed it to the rule of 7. And, it's a completely made up number. It's not real, it's not true. And and we have 60 plus years of really good research that says that it's a completely bogus concept.
Yeah.
That, another one that's a favorite of mine is a completely absurd metric that a 5% increase in retention will double your profits. And this was made up in the mid 1980s, and literally, because I have a copy of the original article where it showed up. This person literally just pulls it out of thin air. And then it gets constantly repeated, and it's shown up 3 times in Harvard Business Review.
Oh, is it the right?
Yeah. And he literally just makes this number up out of thin air, never even attempts to defend it. And it's been repeated thousands of times. And the point is that does it seem even remotely reasonable that a extremely minor change in your rate of retention would double your profits? How does this even work? So no one's thinking through what these various parts of the claim mean and how they would work together.
Yeah,
5% is a very tiny change. How is 5%? And again, what's your churn rate? The inverse of retention. If you have a 10% churn rate and you're going to reduce it by, from 10% to 9.5%, 0.5% change in churn rate, but that's going to magically double your profits forever.
Yeah.
I mean, it's No one's thinking through what these things mean. And instead, what they're doing is it sounds like a smart number. And so they repeat it because they think it makes them look smart.
Yeah.
Without ever thinking about what it means.
I was in broadcast media when I first started in my advertising career, and we used the frequency of 3 at the time as a measurement on how to create campaigns. So like the idea of a campaign, which is based off of the rule of 7, essentially, but you have to run the media weighting so that you get the average audience who's reached 3 times a week. And that was just how we like packaged up campaigns. And then same thing with the 5% increase in retention. I hear a lot. I ask people a lot, like, do you believe on a scale of 1 to 5, that it costs 5 times as much to make a customer than keep a customer?
And that's
slightly different version, but yeah, similar idea.
Well, it costs 5. It's now 5 to 25 times as much to acquire a customer than to keep one. Same guy came up with that, and that wasn't just pulling it out of thin air. That was an intentional lie, and that also goes back to the mid 1980s. But it was based on a research report from 1979 that was actually based on research that goes back to 1976. So we're going half a century back on this. But this research study, and this was a government agency, U.S. government agency that did the study and produced this report that they published in 79. And it was looking at kind of the crisis of customer service and, you know, the concerns around quality in American products.
Mm-hmm.
And way down, excuse me, this paper, or the research report is 130 pages long or something. It's a big, long report. Any footnote on the bottom of page 93 of that report is a little thought experiment that basically, and they say, you know, they tell you they're just making up the numbers just as an example.
Mm-hmm.
But the little thought experiment that they do basically, you know, said that the cost of servicing an unhappy customer is going to eat into your profits. And with the little thought experiment they did, you know, what they showed was that it could consume up to 80% of the profit you made from that sale by handling a customer complaint with that customer versus someone that didn't complain, which meant that a customer who doesn't complain, in their little example, would be 5 times more profitable than a customer that you had to manage a customer complaint with. None of that's terribly unreasonable, but it's this 5 times more profitable is where the X more, except in the little example, it was 2 customers who are already your customer. It wasn't about retaining a customer versus acquiring one. And this quote, this was deliberately misquoted, was deliberately recrafted into it's 5 times more costly to acquire a new customer than to keep an existing one. And, so it's things like this where, and the other thing is if you think through what this means. Think about what, Tide laundry detergent does. The cost of Tide to acquire a new customer is a tiny fraction of the cost of Tide to keep reminding you to buy Tide over the next 50 years. This is why companies like Tide do lots of TV commercials, because they have to keep reminding people who are already customers to continue to be customers by continuing to remind them of the brand. Same as Coke. So, there are many, many examples to where it can cost you 10, 100, 1,000 times more to keep that customer coming back than it ever cost you to acquire them in the first place.
That's a good point. I never even thought about that.
Yeah, and so it's not unreasonable to think that there's some difference between the cost of acquiring and the cost of keeping. But this particular 5X to 25X is just pulled out of thin air. It's completely fraudulent.
Yeah.
But more fundamentally, it's also a deep indication that people are not stepping back and thinking about what this number really means and think through some real examples. And again, another example is you look at any SaaS company. If you think about customer service is, who's responsible for retaining the customer, and sales and marketing combined is who's responsible for acquiring a customer. What is the total internal budget for sales plus marketing versus for customer service, customer success.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, it's 10 or 50 to 1 that the company is spending on sales and marketing to acquire customers versus customer success to keep customers. So, you don't need a lot of complicated math. You just need to sort of think through, if this number were true, then these other things would have to also be true.
Yeah,
and
right.
Are these other things that would have to also be true, when I say them out loud, do they make any sense at all? And so in a lot of ways, this idea of data literacy, and it isn't about knowing a lot of math, because none of these things that we've just talked about involve any equations, any calculus, any complicated statistics. It's only about just how do you sort of think logically about, if this statement is true, then these other things over here have to also be true. And do these other things, if I say it out loud, does it make any sense?
Yeah.
And so it's about having a bullshit detector in your head, so that when someone throws a number out at you, you can sort of think through whether or not this makes any sense at all.
Yeah.
And in fact, so I'll give you another quick example. So before I fell into marketing, I spent time working in finance. And so, I've been through, hundreds, maybe thousands of meetings where we're poring over P&Ls and balance sheets. And one of the things that's very interesting in those meetings around investors in finance is they're looking at like the P&L, or they're looking at the balance sheet, and they're saying, this number and this number produces this ratio. Does that make any sense? Have I ever seen a company that looks like this? What does that tell me about their cash position, or their liquidity, or their ability to service debt, or and so you're looking at the numbers, but you're thinking in terms of, if this number is true, then these other things have to also be true. And does that make sense? And is that a red flag? Or is maybe that an indication that there's something wrong with the numbers we're looking at?
Yeah.
And that same kind of just logical thinking. Again, there's no math here. This is just thinking about things that are presented in the form of numbers as opposed to in the form of words.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was just, it's funny because my mind keeps going to a few different things, and we recorded with Kai and Hannah. One was representing Capero, the other was representing the Swedish Marketing Association.
On the story, yeah.
Yeah, I can never say it.
I know. I've had to say it a whole bunch of times.
You have to be born Swedish to pronounce it.
Yeah.
My goodness. But, at the time, they were talking about, there's over 400 KPIs that are available to marketers. And I think that goes back to this zombie numbers, because it almost feels like we do this to build credibility. We do this to try to showcase that, marketing is incredible. You just need to believe in it. And we get caught between a lot of these. And I love the framing of zombie numbers, if you will, or frameworks even sometimes, that kind of pushes us down this path to showcase literacy, to showcase that we know about our craft and we can go really deep. Why do you think we keep getting hung up on these areas, which in actuality probably nudges us in losing credibility than actually genuinely building it internally?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, and especially when you start to stray into financial metrics within marketing, ROAS, ROI, CAC, MER, these are essentially financial metrics because they're all variants of exactly the same thing, which is an ROI calculation.
Right.
When you start to stray into the realm of financial metrics and you're showing these to finance people, they're not fooled. They know you're full of crap. And here's the problem is that you say something really dumb about how you're calculating ROI. Everybody, around the table with a finance background, which is probably going to be a lot of the senior people in the business, are going to immediately know that you're full of crap.
Yeah.
So then the question is, all these other things that I don't know as much about, like your sales velocity or your, pipeline to whatever ratio that I don't necessarily understand, are they also full of crap about that too? And the chances are the answer is probably yes, because they wouldn't be wrong only about the financial metrics and right about everything else. So what happens is that the moment you say something where they know that you're full of crap, you basically have killed your credibility for all the other things you're going to say.
Yeah.
They don't have that kind of intimate understanding of.
Yeah.
And
I remember
that's the real risk.
I was
huge.
Speaking of ROAS, like, and being full of crap and not knowing what I was talking about. Like when you and I first started working together, we had ROAS number on a lot of Facebook retargeting ads we were running. And I was like, this is amazing. We're at FX.
Mm-hmm.
And then I out loud remember arguing to a few different people, like, you should never stop giving me money because I'm only generating profit with this budget line that you're giving me, and not fully realizing like the credibility of what I was saying, or lack of credibility with what I was saying, or because I thought it was right, or the problem with attribution and just only understanding that conversion number from the point of view of Facebook. So it's interesting because we have these numbers that are available to us. Just because they're available doesn't mean they're right.
And now a short word from our sponsor.
This episode was sponsored by Quadical. Did I say that right? Quadical?
You did. Quadical. Yeah.
Quadical. Mark, what is it?
Well, V, I'm glad you asked. Quadical is my own company, actually. So, I'm the Sleeping Barber podcast co-host with you, but I also have my own company. And so I'm happy to sponsor the Sleeping Barber podcast.
Love that.
Because I give so much time to it. But Quadical is a fractional marketing leadership firm where we specialize in evidence-based marketing. And we do consulting work for companies typically between $30 to $300 million, and helping them navigate some of the challenges that people have, like, I know something's broken, but I'm not quite sure how to fix it, nor do I have the time to fix it. And so that's where we help out a lot of people.
Well, I'll speak for Mark as well, because you're wearing your Quadical hat right now. We appreciate your sponsorship of the Sleeping Barber podcast. And for all those that may be interested, we do have a whole bunch of sponsorship options. Always looking to bring on new sponsors. We have a lot of creative ideas that can really help across a global audience.
Thanks, V.
No, thank you, Quadical. We appreciate your business.
And now back to the show.
Well, just because someone gives them to you and slaps a label on it. And the thing I always say is, even if that bottle of snake oil says that it cures baldness and cancer, doesn't mean that it does either. Just because you put a label on something doesn't make it real. And it doesn't make it true. And, and this is one of the real, issues I have with the MarTech industry is that, a lot of this stuff, a lot of the language, a lot of these metrics come out of MarTech. And the deal with MarTech is it's not in their interest to give you the right number, because the right number is hard to calculate. It's in their interest to give you the easy numbers that they can calculate in a piece of software without any context. And so now that they have this, this number they calculated and they're going to put on a dashboard for you, then they have to give it, they have to brand it. They have to give it some compelling title. And it quickly descends into selling snake oil. That again, every bottle of snake oil, the label, you read the label and it says, it's going to cure, baldness and cancer and whatever else. But just because it's on the label doesn't mean it's real.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the other things, and this is a gotcha for finance people when you start throwing out, numbers with R, return on investment, return on ad spend, is it's always calculated based on revenue. Businesses do not exist to produce revenue. They exist to produce profits.
Mm-hmm.
And so, your return is not how much revenue you get. Your return is how much profit you produce. And even profit is a complicated number. And technically, the return for a unit of the business bringing in revenue isn't going to even profit. It's what's called contribution margin, which is the revenue remaining after deducting the variable cost associated with producing and selling the product. So this company sees a black box that makes things. So we put, $100 in and we get X number of widgets out. We then have another black box called sales and marketing, because they don't really see them as separate. And so we put another $100 in and they sell these 5 widgets, and we add up all of these costs and we compare it against the revenue. Now there's other costs in the business to run the business, but contribution margin is kind of the critical return metric for the business, because that tells you the amount of revenue that you have left over after getting the product sold that we can now use to cover our expenses in the rest of the business, and then have something left over for the investors.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's probably not one marketer in 100,000 who's ever heard the term contribution margin. And but that's return. That's the R in ROI. It's not revenue. And more fundamentally, if marketing went away tomorrow, revenue would keep coming in.
Yeah.
And so because it might be tougher for the sales team. We might have to hire a lot more people to go out prospecting, but so we know that some fraction of that revenue that comes in is generated purely by the efforts of sales, which is why we spend money on sales, because if sales didn't produce, had no contribution to revenue, then it would be a waste and we wouldn't spend a nickel on sales. We would just have marketing.
Yeah.
So that means that only a fraction of that contribution margin is attributed to marketing activities. So, and this goes to this idea of incrementality, that the R in ROI for marketing isn't revenue, it isn't contribution margin, it's the incremental fraction of contribution margin attributed to the marketing activities. And if you're a CFO, that's what's in your head when you see ROI, marketing ROI. And if the words coming out of the marketing people's mouths doesn't match that, then right away the numerator on this number is completely wrong. And it's completely wrong by probably a factor of 2 to 10.
Mm-hmm.
We're not talking about 2% off.
Yeah.
We're talking about hundreds of percent off.
Yeah.
And so already, before you even get to the the denominator, the what did marketing spend, you're completely wrong on the numerator by a massive amount. And so this is why you have to really understand what you're calculating. It's not just pretty words to make people feel good.
You said something about the sales and marketing, that we lump them together, that I just wanted to dig into a bit, because thinking about, you earlier were talking about some of the sources of these zombie numbers. I often think about the funnel as one of those kind of sources for zombie numbers. And then I spent a bit of time looking up the funnel, weirdly enough. It comes from the source of it comes from like 1898, which was almost St. Elias or something like that. I forget the guy's name exactly, but it was a sales guy that invented the funnel. And so recently I read a book from James Herman who talked about sales isn't, and there's a quote somewhere from him about marketing isn't sales done over media. But we have this funnel, which is built from a sales guy to explain how sales works. And we have adopted it for marketing to say it's also how marketing works. But it's influencing, I think, a lot of times the idea that marketing is just sales done over media. And so you have this idea of like, it's, people just flow through this funnel. You put a thing in at the top and something comes out the bottom, like the black widget you were talking about.
Right.
Put a customer in the top and then, you'll have a bit of leakage, but some will come out the bottom. And so I know you've got a framework or an idea around Gumball machines. Can you maybe talk a little about like, is there a difference? Is part of like the model of a funnel influencing how we think about the metrics and maybe
and
this guiding us in terms of what metrics we're using?
Right. And I think it's worth going back to the origin story. And it's worth going back to the origin story on a lot of these things that you hear in marketing, because you can learn a lot from it. The origin story isn't that this guy was just a salesman. He was a sales trainer. And he wasn't training just any salesperson. He was training a very, very specific type of salesperson that was common in the 1800s, which was the door-to-door salesperson. Mm-hmm. And so he was training someone who was literally carrying a suitcase full of brushes or whatever, and literally going from door to door, knocking on the door. And so the AIDA framework, awareness, interest, on down the line, is the sequence of how you're supposed to sequence the conversation when you're standing directly face to face in front of the person holding your suitcase full of brushes. You have to make them aware of who you are and what you're selling. You have to be able to say things to elicit interest, and you have to be able to get feedback from them to indicate that they have a level of interest. Then you have to build desire in them. So it was literally about, walking up to a complete stranger with a suitcase full of products that has no idea who you are and had never heard of the product, and what are the sequence you go through in the conversation. This is very different than marketing. And this is why the funnel concept is it's seductive, but it doesn't really apply to marketing. And I'll give you one specific example, just the A, the first letter, awareness.
Mm-hmm.
That, lots of people will encounter our brand marketing, will develop brand awareness in them. But before they come in market, because we know that most people are not in market right now and will not be in market for, potentially, months or years to come, by the time they're in market, they have forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
And so just because we ticked off the awareness box once doesn't mean that they, by the time they're ready to come in market. So this is very different than a conversation in front of a housewife who opened the door for the Fuller Brush man. Because it's not like, unless they encounter someone with Alzheimer's, it's not like they're going to have forgotten in 5 minutes what the Fuller Brush man said, he was there for.
Right.
So we have a lot of very fundamental things in marketing that just don't match to that model. The other implication here is that, with the AIDA model, is that basically everyone is, and this is, I think, a deeper flaw, but one of the implications is that everyone's in market all the time. Mm-hmm. You can always sell to anyone if you just persuade them hard enough. And we see that these ideas translated into things like, nurture sequences and points-based lead story
ideas.
The whole, all the demand gen, lead gen stuff. That, this idea that everybody's always in market. We just need to get in front of them and be relentless until we wear them down and force them to buy.
Mm-hmm.
Which was very much the concept of the door-to-door salesman from a century ago, to the point that it's a cliche, a long-time cliche within sales around the type of person who's a door-to-door salesman with their foot stuck in the door so you can't close the door.
Right.
And so we see this sort of mindless transference of these kind of sleazy low-end sales tactics into, entire frameworks within marketing, without anyone ever stopping to ask, where did this come from? What does this really mean? And does this in any way really translate into how the real world works and how buyers buy and how markets work? And, and I think this goes back very fundamentally to this notion of we do not interact or operate on the world directly. Mm-hmm. We don't have we have no direct experience of the outside world. We experience the world through models. Even as we walk around with our brains, much of what we're seeing is based on what we expect to see and based on models in our head around what we should expect to see and not see. And we only see the parts that we expect.
Mm-hmm.
The deal with marketing is that you're dealing with very, very large numbers of people that you can't get in front of directly. And you can't directly have any kind of direct experience. And so we're dealing with models of how buyers buy and how markets work. And so one model is everyone's always in market, and the only reason they haven't bought is they haven't been persuaded hard enough.
Yeah.
And therefore, we need to, turn the spam cannon on and give them an endless sequence of nurture emails. And then every time they touch anything, we're gonna measure it and add some points up. And the points are some sort of a measure of how close we've pushed them to the edge of the cliff, so that we can then tip them over as an MQL into sales to finish the job. And the question is this is the implications of that entire sort of marketing sequence. The question is, does any of this correspond to reality, or is this just a fantasy we make up in our heads? And a lot of that sort of traditional B2B marketing sequence comes directly from misinterpreting and not understanding what AIDA is about and where it came from.
Yeah. I don't want to spend too much more time on AIDA, but the reality is, if you think about how long-standing it's been, we've basically crafted metrics around every stage of the funnel, right? There's organizations that still report on the layers of the funnel as showcasing like their ability to convert, because this whole notion of progression from awareness right down to conversion, et cetera. Is there is there a better way, a better metric that we need to be leaning on and understanding, showcasing our efficacy then as marketers?
I mean, it's a good question. To some extent, so I have kind of a definition of marketing, which is marketing is about altering the future state of the world. So doing things is going to alter the future state of the world in ways, specific ways that are commercially advantageous to our company or our product.
Mm-hmm.
And that future state of the world that we're altering is in the form of mental traces, memory traces, and future decision processes in the minds of future buyers. Which means that all the marketing comes down to two things. Either we're implanting durable memory traces in the minds of future buyers,
Mm-hmm.
or we're activating those memory traces once they come in market to activate them into the sales process.
Mm-hmm.
And so broadly, that's performance marketing and brand marketing. Brand marketing is about forming and refreshing memory associations, ideally in the minds of future buyers. So a lot of media planning and targeting is around, are we reaching people who are actually going to buy or just people?
Mm-hmm.
And how, what memory associations are we going to create? Are we trying to create a refresh, specifically around, our distinctive brand assets, connecting them to the product category, and then connecting that to key buying points, key demand points where it would trigger that association once they have a need for whatever the product category is. A lot of the performance marketing is ideally in a perfect world, and I think B2C tends to get this. A lot of performance marketing is how do we trigger those prior memory traces at the right moment in time as they come in market? Can we capture a behavioral signal that indicates that they're actively in market and then put something in front of them that matches what we put in front of them 6 months ago to form the memory, the brand awareness memories, and trigger those memories?
Mm-hmm.
And so, the key thing there is how do we measure how well we're triggering those memories, and how do we capture how well we're forming those memories?
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you focus on those two things, you end up having, you don't need 400 metrics. You can do this with a lot fewer.
Right.
And but I think you have to have a model for what marketing is trying to accomplish to know what it is you're trying to measure and what's important to measure.
So as you're saying that, I'm thinking about, like, in comparison, I mean, obviously my head's going towards like category entry points as an example with the mental physical availability model, rather than say the funnel, which is more about just general top of mind awareness. So where are you at with those kinds of measurements, and like not just general awareness, but salience? Like, how well do I remember something in a particular buying situation?
I mean, the only way you're going to know that is look at behavioral signals, because we can't, take a buzzsaw and remove the top of everyone's head and look inside, because if we did that, all we would see is just a gray goo. And, so a lot of these things, it becomes very challenging to come up with effective measurements, but a lot of these are going to be behavioral measurements. So, for instance, one of the ways to know, so one question that we would want is, when we're doing the performance marketing and we're trying to capture, we've got some indication that they're in market, or we're in a place where they would be if they were in market.
Mm-hmm.
G2, looking at reviews. What sort of signals can we get that indicate that they already had our name in their, the name of our product in their brain? And so one that works, I think, reasonably well these days is looking at brand aware search and the volume of brand aware search for your brand, because no one just accidentally randomly types in, their cat did not walk across the keyboard and accidentally type in your brand name. If someone types in your brand name, it meant that it was already inside their head. And so then the question is, how did it get in their head? So it might have gotten in their head from prior product awareness, prior lived experience with the product. So if you're Salesforce, for instance, a lot of the people who have the word Salesforce inside their head have it because they use the product at some point. But if you're a small insurgent brand, that's probably not true. Another area is someone told you about it. A trusted colleague told you about it. So word of mouth. And then the third area is you did some brand marketing and it reached them and it worked. And so to a certain extent, we don't care how they got it in their head. What we care about is
it's there.
That as large a fraction of new buyers coming in market right now, have us somewhere in their head. Another way to measure this is if you're doing your creative correctly, where your brand marketing looks like your performance marketing, so that you're making good use of distinctive brand assets. You're being consistent in both the brand and the performance marketing and the use of those brand assets. Then your performance marketing should increase in effectiveness as a result of having done the brand marketing. So,
right.
If you've got and I'll give you a very specific example. So I've done billboard campaigns in extremely narrow product areas. So specifically biotech products being sold to research scientists. And we would put up billboards at kind of major traffic choke points coming into large either academic or medical research facilities where there would be a lot of scientists that would potentially buy our product. I could look at my paid search, and the moment that billboard goes up, I can see the paid search jump up in terms of the click-through rates. I can also see my organic search and my brand aware search jump up. I can put that billboard up for a month, but I will still see that elevated click-through rate on the performance marketing, decline slowly over the next 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
Which means that, I've got direct behavioral evidence that I put durable brand memories in people's heads, and those memories are continuing to be triggered by our performance marketing. And this is a very measurable thing.
Yeah. Go for it. No, you go.
Well, I wanted to, it's funny because I kind of wanted to ask this question anyways, but, when we think about the moments where, say, organizations go through some hard times or rough times, natural instinct is to double down on short-term tactics, right? Driving those, the queries, making sure we're measuring conversion rates, et cetera. Is that assuming that brand can't deliver results in the short term? Is that why we naturally go there? Is that just because we feel like that's where the data is leading us to overinvest potentially in those performance marketing areas?
Well, I would say if you go back 30 years ago, this would not be a concept that anybody would find recognizable. I think what you've seen is MarTech packages, because a lot of this is what's happened with MarTech in the last 25 years. MarTech packages are never designed to help you do brand marketing. They're designed to help you generate leads. That's how they're sold, which means that they're entirely focused on aggressive performance marketing stuff. So, I think a lot of these ideas that people have that somehow your brand marketing isn't going to have any effect until way off in the future comes from the narrative of the MarTech companies and not from any sort of reality. And so again, I'm going to say, if you go back 30 years, I think this would be a very alien concept to a lot of marketers. But you have a whole generation that's been trained on just a lot of BS, self-serving BS from the MarTech companies, because the MarTech, these are ultimately not MarTech packages. These are lead gen packages. These are packages about doing things to generate leads right now today. But if you look at the example I just gave about the billboard campaigns, there were people who were in market. The billboard went up on Tuesday. On Tuesday, there were people who were in market to buy right then who saw the billboard. And that day, because I could see it in my statistics, I could see it in my analytics on the search. That day, they went into their office and they typed in my brand name. Which meant that I was at least in the consideration set. Doesn't mean they bought, but it meant I was at least on the radar to be considered, which means that the brand marketing is going to work immediately. in the same way that performance marketing works. The difference is performance marketing only works for people who are actively in the sales cycle, which means that today's performance ad is not going to generate revenue outside roughly one sales cycle of duration. So if you've got a 90-day sales cycle, anybody that you brought into that sales cycle today is either going to generate revenue or not generate revenue for you in 90 days. Where with brand keeps working for months and quarters into the future.
It's fascinating to me because I'm just, as you're saying that, I'm like, there's this also epiphany around targeting, which is related to that, because you have a perception that we can target people precisely down to the single individual person. That they're a female married between the ages of 38 to 60, or 38 to even narrower, 38 years old. Working in southwestern Colorado or something. There's all these layers that we keep putting on and on and on, and then we assume that it's right, and so your targeting then becomes super narrow, and you're trying to find through different mechanisms the person who is in market right now, and then deliver the message to them. And so it leads you down to, like, the idea of performance leads you down this idea of also what we can do with targeting, and at the end of it, none of it might be right. And so there's this idea of, like, why brand matters is because you're not assuming that all the technology is correct and accurate,
which it isn't. And if anyone thinks targeting works, you should read some of the research from Nico Newman, who's a professor out of Australia that studies this. And he has a great paper he wrote looking at he was looking at targeting around a particular category of ads, digital ads. And what he found was that basically the famous line in the paper is that the accuracy of the targeting was no better than a random census of the population. That basically the targeting was effectively just random. But what you do want to do is so if we go back to this idea of marketing is about changing the future state of the world, and that change is embodied in the minds of future buyers. So you would like to be able to at least isolate who's in the ICP. And I think that's more doable, because you don't want, if you're selling, a very specific tool, that 100 specific surgeons in the world is gonna buy, you probably don't want to do a Super Bowl ad, and because you're gonna have a hard time reaching, that target. So I think you want to target who is likely to be a future buyer. I think it's very tough to target beyond that, and it's certainly extremely hard to target around intent. What you can do is you can target venues that are likely to be visited by people who are actively in market. So, for instance, reviews on G2,
trade shows, things like that.
Yeah, or intent-based search terms on Google. It still is a crapshoot as to whether or not these people are just curious or just looking for something else, or they actually in market. But it gives you the ability to have a slightly higher concentration of people that are in market. Here, you're targeting the channel. You're not targeting the person, because I think it's very hard to know if someone is actually in market. But you do know that people who are in market are more likely to be in certain venues than other venues, certain channels versus other channels. But beyond that, I think you have to be able to just hit as broadly as possible, simply because if we go back to the 95-5 rule, which says that a small single-digit % of your market is in market right now. So if nominally if it's 95-5 for you, it can be different numbers for different product categories. But what that would imply is that 5% of your market is going to be in market during the next sales cycle.
Right.
And that means that 95% may not come in market for weeks, months, or even years into the future.
Yeah.
Think about selling cars. The average person in the U.S. buys a car between once every 5 to 7 years. That's a long time to wait. And oftentimes, what leads them to buy a car is the car they have either smashed into a telephone pole, the engine blew up, something completely unexpected, which means that you have no ability to predict when they're going to come in market, which means that you have to do what all of the good all of the good car companies do, which is lots of brand advertising all the time,
Right.
Because essentially everyone buys cars, but you have no idea when a specific person is going to buy one next.
Yeah.
There's so much I want to unpack here, Dale. You talked about intent. What does intent actually? What does it even mean? Intent, right? And I know, like, as marketers, we use that term very loosely from the context of people that are showcasing a level of signals that they're close to purchasing. However, when we think about the platforms themselves that offer that intent-based targeting and whatnot, doesn't sound like it's actually a reliable signal that we could be leaning on.
Well, speaking of snake oil salesman, just because the label on the bottle of snake oil says it cures baldness and cancer doesn't mean it does either. And if you look at what intent data providers are actually providing, they are providing page visit data on your own site, which is crazy, and on third-party sites. And and just because someone visits a certain page on a third-party site does not mean they're in market, and doesn't mean they have intent. And just because a lot of and the other split is intent at the individual level and intent at the account level. So 3 people from this company visited your homepage. Well, if it's a 3-person startup that needs exactly what we're buying, that's probably pretty significant. If you tell me it's 3 people from Google or Ford, that's probably not very significant. It's probably random background noise. And so, there's a lot of things that go into, is there any indication there's actually intent here? And, what's, very interesting with all of the intent data providers is that none of them will give you any validations. None of them will tell you exactly how they're arriving at their scoring. And most importantly, none of them will show validation studies of any sort. Because, how do I know, and I've done these analyses for more than 20 years now. And the question I always come up with, because it's closely related to scoring an MQL, how do I know when someone who's in my system is ready to go to be sent to sales? And so I have all of these sort of indications. So they visited different pages, they looked at different things. So there's all these signals. But these signals could be thrown by people who are absolutely not in market, and you could have people who are in market who never throw these signals. But if I want to know whether or not someone visiting my pricing page is a signal for they're going to buy, the best way to find out is to wait long enough and see if they actually buy. And so you can do these sort of retrospective analyses where you follow the process up to the endpoint, and then you see, did my signal, what predictive percentage did this signal have for this event to occur? I've built these models. I've built many, many of these models. And what I can tell you is the best analysis with very, very large volumes of signals from both first-party and third-party signals is maybe plus or minus 20, 30, 40% in terms of both whether they're in market and whether they're not in market. It's slightly better than flipping a coin. But it's not nearly what people imagine it to be. Because what happens is you have lots of people who for all the world look like they're highly interested that just never come in market. And you have people that for all the world look like they are completely disinterested that will just suddenly pop up and insist on talking to a salesperson and they're wanting to shove a check into your door. So the problem is you have a lot of false positives and false negatives with the signal data. This is not necessarily a problem, and it can still be valuable information to have, but only if you have some sense of how much you can believe the data. And what every single signal company, or intent data provider is doing is they're absolutely refusing to tell you what that data is. They're refusing to allow studies to be done. They won't do their own studies, or if they do, they probably are smart enough not to publish the numbers because they're going to look terrible. So, what they come back with is, oh, we have lots of smart people. Yeah, so did Theranos. So, or they'll come back and say, we have lots of happy customers. Well, every snake oil, this is the classic line. Every snake oil salesman will regale you about all of the testimonials from people where, that assure you that, that bottle of snake oil grew them a whole new head of hair.
Mm-hmm.
And cured Aunt May's rheumatism. So you can't rely on testimonials, and you can't rely on, trust us, we have some smart people somewhere. Show us validation studies. And they don't. So, I think the entire notion of being able to divine intent is possible. There are ways to do it where you can be better than just flipping a coin, but it's very, very problematic, and it's a very uncertain sort of thing to try to build a business around.
Dale, I know we're running out of time, so I have a feeling we'll have you back again at some point to chat about measurement again.
Never enough time.
How do people find out more about you and the work you're doing and all those kinds of things?
The best place is LinkedIn. I'm Dale W. Harrison. I'm the only Dale W. Harrison, which is why I put the W in there on LinkedIn. I'm on there, all the time. I write regularly, on topics related to marketing and specifically to, B2B tech marketing. For a long time, I've worked primarily in the life sciences, but over the last few years, I've pivoted almost entirely out of that into more broadly B2B tech companies. But, I'm always actively looking for new projects and new engagements. I consult with companies around issues around marketing effectiveness and measurement, and basically, how do you spend your marketing budget in ways that are actually going to produce results? And how do you be able to show that?
That's awesome.
Which is, at least for some companies, it's a very important thing.
So everyone out there, if you're not following Dale, make sure you follow him. He's got a lot of great literature out there. So,
yeah, thanks, Dale.
Absolutely. This has been huge fun.
If you like this show, please leave a review. And even if you didn't, we'd love to make this show better, and your feedback will help us do that.